Blaine, we can get started.
Thank you, Christina. Well, good afternoon, everyone, or evening or morning, wherever you're calling in from. My name is Blaine Rushak. I'm the president of the PhD Project, and very excited to welcome you to our fifth in our webinar series focused on DEI and the intersection of business and academe. So a little bit about the PhD Project. The PhD Project was founded 26 years ago, and its main goal was really to create the infrastructure to create a more diverse group of business leaders through our business schools. The model was simple: take professionals that were successful in their careers or students coming out of a successful academic career, encourage them to go get their PhDs and become role models in the classroom. And this was focused on our kind of Black and Brown community, our Native American community, and really from the first day, the success has been tremendous. We have gone from having under 300 faculty of color in the classroom back in 1994 to today, where we have over 1,600 faculty and students, right? And it's making a huge difference, right, in encouraging students of color to want to go get their business degrees, become professionals in their careers, and hopefully maybe someday go back and get their PhD and become that role model in the classroom. So we see it as a kind of a great life cycle. Hopefully you'll be intrigued by our speakers, and we have a great panel of speakers. And the whole point of this intersection is what we wanted to make sure people realize is that business and academe are not silos, right? They are groups that should be working together. When we do get them together, there's so much great conversation and dialogue and tips and guidance on how we can work to make it a better kind of workplace and a more diverse workplace. So I know you'll be really excited to hear what our panelists have to say today. If, as you're listening, you go, that PhD project sounds like something really intriguing. So as a corporate listener, you're thinking, I'd like to get involved. I want to be part of the PhD project. Please feel free to reach out to us on our website. We'd love to talk about the project. Or if you're thinking, I would love to be a doctor, right? I would love to get a PhD and be that role model in the classroom, or be that researcher that's helping make a difference in kind of the business community. Then please also log on to our website, check out the PhD project. Once again, we have a big November conference where it all leads up to coming to that conference and learning what a PhD is, what it is not. And hopefully that would encourage you to take the plunge and become one of our proud members of the PhD project. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our amazing facilitator, Sasha Thompson, who, you will be, very, very pleased with the way she's able to coordinate the discussion, weave us through, create some threads. And my favorite is, and Sasha, I'm going to steal your thunder, she creates nuggets, right? So we're going to get nuggets of conversation that we all live on the edge of our seats to get the nuggets. So Sasha, with no further ado, take it away.
Thank you so much, Blaine. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon to you all. I am truly excited to be here. Again, my name is Sasha Thompson. I am the founder and CEO of The Equity Equation, which is a diversity coaching and consulting firm in the Washington, D.C. area. I have been in collaboration with the PhD Project through this webinar series for the last few months, but have been following their work since, about 15 years. Right. So when I, in another career, worked with them while I was working with the graduate management at Mission Council. So truly believe in the work that they do and look forward to having these conversations every single month. So today we are talking about We Are Not the Same, exploring cultural differences. And as Blaine said, we have three amazing panelists with us today. So our first panelist is Dr. José Rosa. José is a professor of marketing at Iowa State University and a faculty fellow in the university's Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Throughout his career, José has been actively involved in the PhD project and is a tireless advocate for equity, diversity, and inclusion in academic institutions. In 2016, he was inducted into the PhD Project Hall of Fame and received an American Marketing Association Williams-Qualls-Spradlin Multicultural Mentoring Award. He holds a PhD in Business Administration and Psychology from the University of Michigan, an MBA from Dartmouth College, and a bachelor's in Industrial Administration from General Motors Institute. In his professional career, José held marketing, finance, and manufacturing management positions in the automotive and banking industries. As a professor, he has studied minivan and motorcycle market creation and an array of consumer behavior phenomena. He's also served in higher ed administrative roles and was an American Council on Education Fellow in 2013 and 2014. Welcome, Dr. Rosa. Our next panelist is Kathleen Navarro. Kathleen is the Senior Vice President, Chief Diversity Officer, and Head of Talent Management at New York Life, leading the company's integrated talent management and diversity and inclusion strategies. Ms. Navarro heads up the company's Executive Talent and Diversity Council and works closely with New York Life's business areas to align talent and diversity initiatives with business goals. Ms. Navarro holds an MBA in accountancy from Baruch College Zicklin School of Business, a BS in statistics and management from New York University Stern School of Business, and a certification in building and leading diverse organizations from the Harvard Kennedy School Executive Education. She sits on the board of National Diversity Council and is a member of Beta Gamma Sigma, Financial Women's Association, 30% Club Steering Committee, ACLI Chief Diversity Officer Big Think Group, and Gartner Talent and D&I Councils. She has been recognized as a top 10 champion of global diversity by Diversity Global, a top executive in corporate diversity by Black Enterprise, a top 50 chief diversity officers by the National Diversity Council, and included on the most powerful and influential women's list by the National Diversity Council. Kathleen, welcome. And last but certainly not least, Ron Adams. Ron is the Vice President of Field Diversity and Inclusion at Northwestern Mutual, where he leads a team of diversity practitioners responsible for the creation and execution of diversity and inclusion strategies for the organization's career distribution system. In this role, Ron co-leads the Northwestern Mutual D&I Corporate Committee and serves on the Field Experience Talent Management Leadership Team. Excuse me. Ron joined Northwestern Mutual in January of 2015, and after a 26-year military career where he served in many roles, including the Wisconsin National Guard's Diversity Officer, Equal Employment Manager, Human Resources Branch Chief, Public Affairs Officer, and completed 2 successful commands. Excuse me. He was recognized as one of North America's most influential D&I leaders, 2020. He serves on the CFP Board Diversity Advisory Group and is a member of the National Diversity Committee for the Association for Advanced Life Underwriting. Ron is a recipient of the Army's General Douglas MacArthur Leadership Award, the NAACP's Roy Wilkins Renown National Service Award, a member of the Honorable Order of St. Barbara, and numerous military awards and decorations. Ron holds a BS in Business Management and earned a Master's in Arts in Strategic Communications and Leadership from Seton Hall University. Welcome, Ron. Whew, okay, so now that we've gotten through all of that, I'm so happy that we are having this discussion today. For the last 18 months or so, it's really been monumental for diversity and inclusion efforts, both in the academic and the business sectors. And between the racial unrest of last summer, the rise of anti-Asian violence throughout the pandemic, and support of our Pan-Arab colleagues, there's been a lot to juggle. So over the last few years, we've witnessed terms that have kind of grouped some folks together, right? POC, people of color, or BIPOC, Black Indigenous people of color, and used to group these groups together to try to create a singular identity, or at least identify and say, okay, this is a group that's having a different experience. But each community within those groups is very different and unique and nuanced. And we've realizing that they don't require the same support. And so, Jose, I want to start with you. And so as we see these buckets of identities in both the academic and corporate spaces, in what ways can we support, in what ways can those buckets hinder or support our efforts as we move forward?
Sure, I'm happy to comment on that. Those buckets are we would call it categories, right? And categorization from a human perspective is incredibly useful. We've only been doing it for 60,000 years or so. It helps us make sense of the world and respond to it, right? So our minds, in many ways, are categorization machines. So it can be very useful. On the other hand, there's another phenomenon of the mind, which is how we talk about things eventually becomes how we think about things. And when we use these labels often, and there's a set of associations that are very quickly made to them, right? Then what happens is that after a while, that is all we think about, right? The notion that inside of that bucket, there can be a lot of variability kind of gets lost. It gets kind of pushed. So on the one hand, they're incredibly useful for us to make sense of our world. On the other hand, these buckets can also become limiting because they become rigid. They become inflexible. And in that sense, I think that's not a good thing. So we want to use them, but we want to use them very carefully.
Thank you. And actually, I want to piggyback on that a little bit with you, because I know when we were talking before, we talked about just the nuances of those buckets, right? You touched on it just now, right? We're talking about, the Latinx bucket, right, and the diversity within. And so when we create these buckets, what are we losing when we talk about, the Latinx experience, for example?
Yeah, well, I think that the buckets are created sometimes institutionally. The government is great at creating buckets, right? Because it needs to inform policy and it wants to be inclusive in its policy making. So it tries to come up with a bucket that is sort of inclusive and embracing and everything, okay? But how does that bucket become something in our heads? Well, it's a label. It's a label that when we were first introduced to it, like BIPOC, right? Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Okay, I just said that label. If you never encountered it before, you're going to create a picture in your mind because we don't think in words, we think in pictures. Okay, so now I've got this idea, and now you tell me, but remember that every one of these groups is diverse, and I go like this, and then I expand my image to include 3 or 4 people that are Black or Indigenous, and oh yeah, I know so-and-so, and so now I have this little group of associations. The more I talk about BIPOC, the more I talk about whatever label, that image, that representation, unless it goes unchecked, becomes increasingly fixed. It just gets affirmed in our minds. And in that sense, this is what I mean by they're great and yet at the same time limiting. It's the way kind of our mind works, right? So the idea is that we create a bucket, but that bucket should always be linked to the notion of it needs to be updated. It's not rigid, it's evolving. Our minds don't work so well with evolving, so.
And I love that. And that actually goes nicely into the question I have for you, Ron. So we know, I know in talking to you that Northwestern has several employee resource groups, right? Affinity groups, employee resource groups across over 70 field offices, if I remember correctly. And how do you all balance the individual experiences of the group as well as the collective experiences that Jose just spoke about?
It's a work in progress. I think I try to tell, as we do this work, the aim is not perfection. The aim is excellence and continuous improvement. I think we need to start there. Also, before I get into it, I think what's also important as a practitioner, something that I teach, and I'll be publishing something on my LinkedIn page here shortly, because I think it's a critical part of the conversation. There are these 5 Ds that you come up against when you're trying to do diversity and inclusion, from my experience. And one of them is distraction. And I think distraction, although the differences are critical and important, hear me when I say that, we cannot allow them to become a distraction from the inclusive environment and cultures that we're trying to create. And so I just want to put that stake in the ground as I continue to share. And so from a corporate perspective, we have our ERGs, employee resource groups, which are very strong and only getting bigger and better. And And those groups, they have their strategy sessions, they put things in place. And I'll tell you from an Asian perspective, you think how big Asia is. Like, so let's just think about all the people we just put into this particular bucket, right? And to the doctor's point, there's a good reason for that. It just like a strategy. When you put your goal up, your goal doesn't have everything included in it, but then you have action steps and processes under there that gets into the meat of what you're trying to do. I think from a corporate perspective, that's how these buckets are used from my perspective, right? We need something at a high level to be able to get our bearing, and then we put teams together to make sure that they unpack that. And so our agent ERG would once put up a map of Asia, and they had people putting pins into all the different countries and different areas that they've been, and they're able to educate the rest of us on just how dynamic, when we use a term, how dynamic they really are. And so that's one of the ways that we do it. We use the bucket, but we allow these teams to unpack them and educate us. And as far as the 76 network offices, we actually have diversity and inclusion councils at those locations. And they kind of do the same thing. They try to unpack what we may put out from a corporate perspective to try to capture the different individuals who are part of the organization.
You know, I love the visual, as Jose said, right? We think in pictures. And so as soon as you said, you know, a map of Asia with pins, I'm just imagining kind of what that looks like and how diverse, you know, that is. And especially when you talk about like Asian American and Pacific Islander, right? Like AAPI, I think I read recently that that's over like 46 countries that you're talking about, right? Which is 46 different cultures. And then, you know, how many other languages on top of that? And so it's just beautifully diverse in that. And how do you dive deep into understanding each of those?
Yes. And I think the idea that we are continuous learners, I'm a practitioner, but I learned a long time ago that there's a lot more that I don't know than I do know, which keeps me in a continuous learning position. And so I don't have all the answers, but I am more than willing to learn more about someone else in the organization so that I could be better.
Thank you. And Kathleen, we're going to get your voice in here. You know, New York Life is similar in that your efforts have been around for years. Like, you all are not new to the game in this. And so how do you all make sure all of the voices are heard in each of those, you know, buckets that you have as well too?
Sure, thanks. You know, we do have a long-standing program, and we focus equally on diversity, that is the representation of our workforce, and inclusion. And that's the environment and the culture that we foster. And that's really key to having all voices heard. You know, it's foundational to have an inclusive culture where people can show up as their true, authentic selves, share their perspectives, and have their voices heard. And you have to be intentional about these efforts, you know, and provide opportunities for everyone to grow and learn together. Like you just pointed out, Ron, like be a continual learner, right? And really keep challenging ourselves. And, you know, I'll just mention quickly, like 3 ways that that you can do this. It's not all inclusive, but thinking about communications and training, ERG programming, like Ron mentioned, and then company-wide campaigns. So with communications and training, you know, I think taking it to the next step beyond unconscious bias training, thinking about inclusive leadership training, helping support our managers so that they understand, you know, how they can ensure that all team members are treated equitably, that people feel like they belong, right? That they're part of the team, and that everyone has access to resources and support so that they can achieve their full potential. And then coupling that with communications, looking for opportunities for people to be able to share their stories. Storytelling is really critical and powerful and important. And we're in Asian American Heritage Month this month, right? And it's a great opportunity. You're talking about all the diverse cultures within the Asian community. Well, share stories about that during the Heritage Month, right? And that kind of leads into our employee resource groups. We have 7 communities that we support through our resource groups, and really sort of balancing, you know, the programming and the efforts across the groups gives opportunities to have employees' voices heard throughout the company. You know, leaning into that programming during the Heritage Months, having those strategic plans like Ron mentioned, right, is really critical. And then when you have strategic plans, you can also then see where there may be some commonalities and where there's intersectionality, and where you can sort of collaborate the efforts across the employee resource groups. And then we also focus in on company-wide campaigns as a way to sort of educate and raise awareness in sort of interesting, fun, different ways. So we do these annual campaigns. We've been doing them for a number of years, and each year they build on each other. Last year's campaign was You Belong, Building a Future Where Everyone Belongs. And then that fed into this year's campaign, which is Social Justice in Action. You know, let's talk about us. And it's this campaign in particular is really giving rise to employees being able to share aspects of themselves so that we can learn more about each other. We can sort of get a sense of what it may be like to walk in one another's shoes. We do videos where we show employees sharing their stories. We do monthly activities, and people share reflections on our intranet and engage in a conversation, you know, over the intranet. And then we have also other programs where we bring people together to have, you know, in-person conversations. So touching on it from you know, different efforts and providing opportunities for every employee to really be able to have that to be able to share, but also to have that sort of foundation and that culture, and really articulating to the company as a whole that, you know, this is really important, and that we really do truly value people being themselves, and people, you know, showing up as their authentic selves is really key to all of it.
You know, Kathleen, one of the things that you said that really kind of stuck with me was, you know, you're taking folks through these trainings, they can get all of this education. And, you know, in my work, some of the things that I hear, especially in the coaching side, is the importance of storytelling, right? Mm-hmm. The importance of how do you connect those stories to what managers are learning in the classroom, right? What they're learning in these sessions. So when you talk about a microaggression, like what does that look like in the workplace? And really taught people not just telling their stories of, oh, this is, you know, this is where I'm from, but this is how this microaggression of, oh, you speak so well, right, shows up for my community, or, you know, those types of things. And I think that's the not so fun, sticky stuff that, you know, we have to kind of dive into when we do this work.
Totally agree, you know, and it is challenging, right? We have to challenge ourselves, and there's one thing to be able to tell your story and tell it like, you know, I don't know, talk about things that might be a little bit, you know, easier for people to hear. And then there's telling your story and telling it like what it really means for someone to be themselves, right? And the issues they may face that people don't necessarily see or understand. And it brings it to a human level. And when it's the colleagues you work with and the colleagues that you know and friendships that you've grown through like a number of years, and you hear these different perspectives, it brings a whole different light to it. You know, we started engaging in courageous conversations back in 2016. And our first courageous conversation, we had 3 employees share personal stories. And it was 2 Black men who shared unwarranted encounters with the police, and 1 white woman who shared a story when she recognized unconscious bias in herself, which was a pretty brave thing to talk about in front of the whole company. And when the men shared their stories, and we heard that, you know, the one gentleman talked about how he was concerned walking through Penn Station to come to work because of the armed guards that were there at the time with big guns, right? And, you know, other people are walking through feeling like, oh, I can feel safe, where other people, you know, and others are walking through thinking, oh my gosh, it takes just one little thing that may be a misunderstanding and my whole life will be different, right? And it just brings it to this level of deep sort of connection that you don't get when you go through a training class.
Yeah, and you know, that absolutely ties into the question that I have for Jose. And, you know, again, my wheels are turning in my head because, you know, you said 2016 and that's what happened. I was like, 2016 is the first time I actually called out Black at work, right? Because there was so many shootings that were happening around that time. And I ended up telling my story of why I took off of work. And I was the first Black female hired at that company, right? So it was just a very new experience. But to talk about that, started actually kicking off our D&I efforts at that company. So again, the importance of storytelling. And Jose, you know, when we spoke, you told the story of, and we're taking this kind of really to an individual level, and we'll go back out, but you told the story of this, you being ambiguous, right? You being Tony and how that was perceived. And so can you talk a little bit about that? But it kind of also goes into shaping your experience, right? And these are the stories that we need to share.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to speak to that. And I want to affirm this notion of narrative, okay? The science is ample that the way that we achieve as shared meanings is by sharing our narratives. And what I mean by narratives is the more personal we are, the more we are able to connect with each other, because that's where we project emotion. So let me tell you my narrative, which is a little different than the person wearing, you know, crossing Penn Station, the Black man wearing Penn Station. As you can see from my looks, I don't look Puerto Rican, but I am, okay? Born and raised on the island. But I used to go by Tony, right? And that how I got that nickname is a whole other story. But for many, I was Tony Rosa. And to a lot, when I moved to this country, to a lot of people, that sounded Italian. So they put me into the Italian bucket. And then what would happen, what has happened multiple times, is that at some point or another, they find out that I'm not Italian, that I'm Puerto Rican. Now, let me put you into the psychologist mindset for a minute. They put me in a bucket, Italian. They committed to that notion with me. They engaged me emotionally. We became friends. I was their Italian friend. And then it turns out that I'm not Italian, that I'm Puerto Rican. Now, some people will say, oh, I made a mistake. Nice to meet you, Mr. Puerto Rican Tony Rosa. For other people, because they were already emotionally committed to a relationship with me, but now I don't belong in the group that I thought they belonged, that's a little jarring. And the most interesting response that I would get is that people would say to me, but you lied to me. I never lied. I had no idea you were having this internal conversation in your head and that you had felt comfortable with me because you thought I was Italian. But now that you find out I'm Puerto Rican, you say, you lied to me, you deceived me. And you can pretty much imagine that at that point, that relationship changed dramatically. I went from being a friend to being a deceiver, not to be trusted, which, oh, by the way, is the label that we put on Puerto Rican sometimes. I mean, it became personal real quick to the negative. And I think that happens, you know, this is the importance of considering the notion that inside of each one of these categories we create, there's a wealth of diversity that really needs to be acknowledged and respected. Because I don't look like the stereotypical Puerto Rican that maybe was portrayed in a movie, okay? But I certainly am, it's my identity and I love it and I love my heritage. And oh, by the way, a lot of those stereotypes just don't apply to me, not either physically nor behaviorally. But oh my gosh, you know, all too often that label has become so much how we represent things that then when new data comes in that offsets that, it makes us nervous. It makes us uncomfortable. But that can be addressed, because the better we are prepared to receive additional information, the better we are able to then adjust those buckets, you know, and what's inside of them. But people need to be encouraged and trained, and there needs to be a recognition and a rewarding, a social rewarding. You know, we need to be able comfortable saying to each other, Ron, I congratulate you for being such a thoughtful individual and being so broad-minded and able to update things. Kathleen, you are admirable in your ability to continually react to people as individuals and to acknowledge their uniqueness. I mean, we want to encourage that when we see it, because that's a social reward that affirms us in the best approach, which is hold the categories, but don't let them become so rigid that you can't see the richness of what's out there.
Thank you. That was
Sorry if I
absolutely...
disappointed either one of you by saying that I'm Puerto Rican. Hopefully you're okay with that.
I already knew. But no, that was a great transition, because I think, part of what happens, is, again, we have these categories, right? A lot of organizations, we talked about the government, create these categories, or this idea of what falls into this category. And, I wanted to share the story of one of the first events that I went to at one of the companies that I worked for, was an evening of receptions, right? The ERGs were having the receptions. And so I'm excited. This is the first time I'm getting to meet folks. And I see that the women's ERG is meeting on this side and the Black employee ERG is meeting on this side. And I'm like, well, where do they want me to go? Like, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do. So part of what I started noticing very quickly was, like you said, those buckets become so siloed that people with intersectional identities have to pick and choose how they want to show up, right? We can't quite split ourselves. And so, Kathleen, I want to go back to you and talk about, how do you all address those intersectional identities within those cultural silos?
Sure. So we do a lot of collaboration across our employee resource groups, and it took a little time, right? When our resource groups were first formed, going back like over 20 years ago, you would see the members of that community be involved. We really didn't have a lot of allies participation. That grew over time. And we also didn't have a lot of collaboration across the ERGs. And so for what we saw in the beginning, I'd say, is women of color would be joining the ERGs, the race-based ERGs, and the women's initiative. It was diverse, but it wasn't as diverse as it is now, right? That because there was sort of like this pull. And now we have this collaborative environment where each ERG has their strategic plan. They've got their efforts they focus on, but then they also collaborate, and we'll have, we may have women of color get together, and it could be across, for example, our women's initiative and our other ERGs, and they'll come together and they'll do a program, or they'll just meet and talk and sort of and we see this. We see the veterans group in our group for people with disabilities often, coming together. Or, for example, our Pride group, has done programs on coming out in diverse communities and communities of color and what that means. And so you start to get this really rich dialogue going, and you start to have this programming that is multidimensional, right? And it's not only focused on like a narrow focus. And then we also really look to understand what, as best we can, sort of what people's experiences are, and looking at different opportunities where we do listening tours, or we hear from our employees, right? And when we do that, we really take a multidimensional analysis approach. So we'll do our employee engagement survey. And when we do the analysis, we do cuts that get really sort of looking at all different populations. So certainly we look at race and gender and tenure and location and things like that, but we may look at people who have gone through a development program, and then is it different? Are we seeing different experiences for women and women of color, or different communities within the people who have gone through the development program? So the analysis piece of it, and ensuring that we're asking questions and we're having opportunities for employees to be able to share their experiences and give us feedback, is really critical to all of this, as well as we're trying to understand how we could best meet the needs across all different cultures and communities.
Thank you. Before we move on to Ron, because I want to get you to answer a similar question, I want to encourage folks that are watching, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A, so we can try to get some of those in while we're doing this as well. So Ron, what are you all doing to kind of, again, address those intersectional identities and look beyond kind of the siloed thinking?
Yeah, Kathleen hit the nail on the head. I mean, we're doing much of the same in terms of the collaboration across the ERGs. I think one of the areas that we're really deliberate in is creating the direction. You can change systems and processes and actions, but if you don't change the thinking that created them, you'll stay in the same silo. So I focus a lot on the thinking and the approach, and we have to create this dynamic, flexible environment. And that's where the intersectionality becomes natural to the way that we're interacting with one another. And so one of the tools that we use, and many people have seen it, is the wheel, the dimensions of diversity wheel. And so we've incorporated inclusive leadership and diversity and inclusion, cultural competence training into all of our leadership development curriculum, onboarding curriculum, things of that nature. But one of the tools the ways of using that tool that I think is extremely important to this particular question is, what if you take that wheel and you put it in front of someone and you ask them, tell me, circle the couple of the dimensions that you think about most, that impact you most, how you show up. And so for me, I would circle race. I would also circle occupation because of my military. I lead with, that would be the question. What do you lead with? And I lead oftentimes when I meet people, I talk about my military experience. Why do I do that? Because of my race. Now I had to think about that, why that was something that I did. And I did it because it disarmed people. At least that's what I felt. When they know that I served, they take down some of their biases and they listen to get to know me better. And so when you think about intersectionality, all of these things that make me who I am, I can have that conversation using that particular dimensions of diversity image. And so we try to build that thinking into all of our training and engagements to try to bridge those gaps.
I'm smiling because I literally day before yesterday, did that exercise, right, with the group. And what shocked them, so one of the areas of diversity that pops up that's high for me, but it's invisible, is that I was born outside of this country, right? So I didn't become a US citizen until 2016, though I was raised in this country. And so because of that, it shapes so much of how I see things. But unless I say it, people assume, oh, okay, Black American, right? And I'm just like, not really, but again, it's like, I didn't realize that how much that showed up for me and why I respond the way I do to certain things because of that experience.
And I'll tell you the reason I really love that tool is because the white men, they engage as well. Yeah. There are certain things that they lead with too, right? So when we talk about diversity, I think that's something that's critical that I often share, but at the start of any time I'm engaging around this, is that I don't make the room diverse because I'm a Black guy in the room. We're diverse because we're all different. So I'm not the one that make the room diverse and bring everyone into the conversation.
Yep, I love it. Absolutely love it. So one of the questions that came in, I think ties really nicely into this, is some organizations feel that courageous conversations are risky for a variety of reasons. So what barriers, if any, did you face in getting these great programs rolled out? Or how would you recommend staff challenge leadership to overcome some of those objections. So if anyone wants to jump on that.
I can jump in on that. You know, I had mentioned that we started our program in 2016. And when we, and as you mentioned, that was a period where there was, we were seeing a number of shootings of unarmed people across the country, and which has continued, right? It was not an isolated situation, but that was when we first started to think about what happens outside of the office, at least for at New York Life, you know, affects us when we're at work. And it's imperative that we talk about this. You can't check at the door, you know, how you're feeling and what's happening. And so when we embarked on it, you know, it was interesting. I was originally, you know, I'm at the company a long time and I bring certain biases with me. And I was thinking initially, we have to lead up to having a conversation. So I had just pitched an idea. We'd have a moment of silence. Then from there, we'd start to do some training, and then we'd start to, right, then we'd do these building blocks, and, you know, I don't know, like a year out, maybe we'd have our first conversation. And then our Black Employee Resource Group came to me and they said, we'd like to have a discussion on what's happening. And they initially met within their core team, but then we said, well, let's just go for it, right? But we want to do it in a thoughtful way. So at the time, we found a partner to help us because it was the first time we were engaging in these conversations. And we spent some time really thinking about how do we educate employees? Like, what would the session look like? We had an educational component. We had storytelling component. We educated around racial anxiety because our unconscious bias program up to that point hadn't really touched on racial anxiety. It was different. So we wanted people to understand that. Then we wanted people to understand, how do you engage in these conversations? And we introduced some best practices, and then we had facilitated table discussions. And that was more than 30 conversations ago. And now we'll have a speaker come in. Then that evening we'll go and have cocktails, and we'll talk about what we, you know, have a conversation over drinks and like in a much more informal setting, right? It took us a long time, but having a very structured approach, and you have to have the commitment. We hear this all the time, but you have to have the commitment from the top, right? Our CEO, when I spoke to the CEO about it, he said to me, I'm fully supportive of whatever, you know, you think is best, and I want to be involved. And so that helps set the tone too. And then thinking about, I mentioned that we had the storytelling, having different perspectives so you can hear from different people. And then thinking about doing it in ways that make people comfortable and can be in the sense that, I mean, you want to push people and you want people to be able to get out of their comfort zone, but in the sense that like you have different topics or you try to do it in different ways. So I mentioned we did facilitated table conversations in the beginning and then moved. We've also done things like we'll watch an episode of Blackish and just have a group of people get together and talk about it. It can be all different, ways of hitting this. And so, but starting with a structured approach, making sure you've got trained facilitators, making sure that you give an education component so people understand why it's important that they engage in these conversations, because that's critical as well. There was a study that was done by the Center for Talent Innovation back in 2016 or 17 on easing racial tensions at work. And in that study, it really gives a lot of really striking statistics on why it's so critical we have conversations like this at work, which helps people, if they understand the why, it helps them more apt to participate. And that also gives some great tips on how to actually do it. So I recommend you check it out.
I would agree with that. I think you have to make sure that there's a certain level of trust that needs to exist. So you have to start out, you have to have a strategy. Like, so we have a 15-year roadmap, and we're about 8, 9, 10 years into a 15-year roadmap. So you have to be consistent over time, and you have to have buy-in. And then when you bring those stories to life, everyone needs to be included in the storytelling process. You don't go and get the people who are maybe suffering at the time to be the only ones sharing stories. So one of the things we do is we teach in our leadership development training Storytelling is a skill set of great leaders. So you teach the power of storytelling in general. You have a D&I component of that leadership development program. And then the task is for these leaders to develop their D&I story. And then these leaders get to share their D&I stories with their peers, get feedback, refine their story, master their story. And now I need you to share that with the organization. I need you to share that with your team. And so it's not just the Black person or the woman sharing a story. You have these white men who share their story, because when they think hard enough about it, they remember the first time they interacted with diversity and inclusion. What was that experience? How did it impact you? What decision have you made since then? And it's a power in that story. And so that's another technique. And then the last one I will share from a storytelling perspective, we do something called the reader's choice, or the reader's theater. And we have these stories that maybe, so we just had one a couple of weeks ago when we had a big session around the Black African American experience. And we had stories of individuals from our organization. But we gave these stories to other people. And at the beginning of the session, all quiet, these stories were read. So a white man may have read it, a woman may have read it. And at the end of it, we put people into these groups and they discuss what they learned, what they felt, what that means to them. And so that's another way to share stories in a group setting. So you don't have to actually have the person share their story as well.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. I facilitate for an organization and we use that often, right? Getting stories from the employees. And what usually happens is they're like, that happened here?
Yes.
Like, yeah, that happened here, right? Yeah. So it really is eye-opening in doing that. So Jose, I want to bring your voice back in here because, you know, I'm hearing a lot of opportunities for corporations to kind of lean into the research, right? Kathleen kind of talked about that a little bit. You know, how can universities and corporations work together in this space?
Okay, well, certainly one of the ways that we can work together is by applying the science and teaching it in the classroom in a way that it becomes really operational. So I'm going to use some examples to make that happen. I'm going to go back to the notion of categories, right? Our minds are wonderful. We create categories, but we can create them that are permanent or seem to be forever, but other ones are just created on the spot. I'm going to give you an example. Let's assume that I'm going to use Sasha as an example. Let's assume that I'm going to buy Sasha a gift. Now I can start that process by saying I want to buy her a piece of personal electronics, in which case that category is the one that's dominant, right? And so, and I go through that and then I choose buy her a gift. But let's assume that I instead say, I want to buy Sasha something that is going to make her joyful. Now, quite frankly, an Apple iPhone could be in the first category, but it could also be in the second category. But the manner in which I approach the problem defines what is highlighted. And one of the things that we try to teach in universities is that level of critical thinking, that level of step back from a particular perspective and approach it in a new way. And to the best of our ability, we try to teach our students how to humanize the categories. Think about the need, right? So I just showed you, I mean, the question that I just posed to you about the where does the iPhone fit, actually it's a real marketing problem. And if you think about it, then you start understanding how Apple, positions its products, because they never talk about personal electronics. It is all about the joy, the consumption, about the beauty. Mm-hmm. It is incredibly human, right? But we can teach people to harness that ability to create those type of mental representations about others, and we really want to. And so we do it through training and sensitivity, but also through that personal experience. And I'm going to use this moment to make a plea with you and everybody else that's listening. Right now in the United States, a lot of educational institutions are a little bit under the gun because we're teaching people how to think diversity and how to respond this way. And some folks in our communities are calling that negative, are seeing that as indoctrination, which it's not. But we as universities could do more to give you that workforce that is already primed for the very experiences you're creating. And we want to, and then we find sometimes our hands tied because there are some people say, oh no, you can't do that anymore. So to the best of your ability, all of you who are listening, if you have anybody's ear, say, hey, let university, hold them accountable to be responsible, but let them do what they do best, which is to apply the science to the training to give us people who are prepared to make a better society. That has been our job for 400 years, and we want to keep doing it. So for what it's worth, sorry, I went off on a political announcement.
No, I
you can tell it's close to my
that.
heart.
Yes, I appreciate that. And we've talked about that in past webinars as well too, right? There's this huge opportunity to really collaborate and create these, I'll call them, I don't want to, inclusive managed, like people that think with inclusive management and inclusive equity in mind to go into these corporate spaces, right? And so that it's not a restarting, it's okay, now let's take it to the next level every time you have someone come in. And so I appreciate that. But again, that's, my academic side, talking to this corporate side constantly. And
if I could jump in here, I think
go for it, Ron.
you position it, when I think about in diversity and inclusion, I think of it as a competency.
It is,
yeah. It's a competency. As someone who served 33 years in the military, there's a definition of leadership that we have in the Army. And the definition of leadership is the process of influencing others by providing purpose, direction, and motivation to accomplish a mission or to improve the organization. If that's the definition of leadership, the process of influencing others, first, that tells me that it's not about me. How am I going to influence them? By providing purpose, direction, and motivation. How am I going to do that if I don't know them? That's diversity and inclusion. That's equity, because I can't inspire Sasha the same way that I inspire Dr. Rosa. But what happens is that's what we try to do. And then when one of you fail because you're not motivated that way, I blame you.
Yeah.
That's why this is important. That's why this needs to be taught.
I love it. I love it. I'm just like, yes. That's that's what we all need to be talking about. So we only have a few minutes left. And as Blaine shared with you, I always ask, my last question is, what are 2 to 3 nuggets that you want the audience to walk away with, right? As they're thinking about this work, as they're thinking about understanding the nuances of cultures within their organizations and their communities, and how to raise up complex conversations, right? Not just difficult or courageous, but sometimes it's complex and you need to hear both sides. How do you do that? So what are 2 or 3 ways that you would leave with them? And so Kathleen, I'll start with you.
Sure. So I would say that you have to do it, right? And you push yourself out of your comfort zone. And sometimes we want to be able to check all the boxes, right? We want to be fully educated. We want to be fully comfortable. We want to know we're in a safe space. We want to know, right? And it doesn't always align that way. If we wait for all of that to happen, then we don't engage in the conversations. And if we don't engage in conversations, we're not going to bridge differences and grow together as a society. So push yourself and to be open-minded. And we use this oops and ouch method, which sounded a little basic when we first were thinking about it, but it really does help. When you're engaging in a conversation, we always assume that good intent, right? We have the best intentions and things sometimes don't come out as we intend to. And if we paralyze ourselves by not engaging at all, being afraid, we don't engage at all. So, be thinking like, if something doesn't go the way it said, like, oops, that wasn't what I intended and I'm sorry. Or ouch, I know you didn't mean it this way, but that actually hurt and here's why. So just a simple way to kind of put into practice sometimes things that may be a little bit more challenging for us.
Thank you. Ron.
I think, well, I was just sitting here thinking there's so much I want to share, but I would say, I think you want to focus on continuous improvement and not perfection. If people know that you have good intent, you will be amazed of the grace that they will give you if they understand that. So continuous improvement, not perfection. And then you want to be effective and not right. There's a difference. Like you could be right and wrong at the same time. So it's about being effective, which means sometimes you have to pull back. Sometimes you have to shift how you communicate. And you're trying to find ways to connect with those who you are trying to move. And sometimes you can't focus on being right. Focus on being effective.
Wow, appreciate that. And Dr. Rosa.
2 to 3 nuggets. These
I know it's a challenge.
These are thorny issues. I mean,
Yeah.
if we could really, if we could come up with 1 or 2 things that were going to solve these issues, we'd be millionaires, right? Because we were to solve some of the things have plagued us for hundreds of years, really. This is a human issue, and in America it takes one form, but we have a long history of this. And so historically, the people that have been the most effective in moving the needle, and by the way, most of us move the needle a little tiny bit, is people who are willing to forgive themselves and who are willing to forgive others. It sounds so trite, so simple, almost religious, but it's so important. We are going to stumble. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to put ourselves out there and make ourselves vulnerable, and somebody's going to kick us. We have to forgive ourselves when we make a mistake. We have to forgive that other person when they actually do that. There's a limit to forgiveness. Obviously, violence, we don't tolerate that. But my experience has been the majority of people that have hurt me did not do it intentionally. And they were just as afraid as I was. And when I am at least willing to give that, to just acknowledge that, at some point I'm willing to come back. Okay. Some relationships can be healed and some cannot, but everyone deserves at least a second chance. And so that would be my sense. But we're in this for the long haul. Keep this in mind. Yeah. This is a long game. But the more people that play this long game, the sooner and the more effectively we reach the goals that are needed. So it will take us all continuing to stay the course.
Thank you so much. There's just this is just the tip of the iceberg, right? We could have gone another hour with this conversation and this topic. I thought it was very important to have this discussion because of what, I was hearing kind of in the field of, we're grouping people together. They have different experiences, but I'm also seeing the beauty of how you pull those conversations together. And how in doing that, you're talking about the good, bad, and the ugly, right? But in doing that, you're moving forward. And how do we continue to have those conversations? And like you said, sometimes we may hurt each other, but it's all in this way of learning and growing and developing into a greater, better society. And so with that, I want to thank you all for participating in this panel discussion tonight. This has been absolutely phenomenal. I want to thank everyone that has joined us. You all blew up the Q&A, so we couldn't even get to everything that I wanted to. There were some great questions in there. But, we will definitely try to stay engaged with you throughout our next session. Our next session will be in June. And so that topic will be coming out to you all in the next few weeks. And we are really looking forward to seeing you again in our next session. So thank you to everyone. and have a wonderful evening, morning, or afternoon.
Ron, Kathleen, thank you. have
Thank
made
you. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. Pleasure. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Sasha. Take
Bye-bye.
care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.